This video on Firefly and the Lost Cause sparked a lot of comments about my drawing a distinction between slavery as the underlying macro-level cause of the American Civil War, as distinct from the reasons why individuals actually fought. Specifically on my statement that the average Confederate soldier wasn't fighting for slavery.
I'm fighting for my rats. All of us here, that's what we're fighting for.
For your what?
For our rats.
A lot of video links and book recommendations refuting that statement followed, most notably for James McPherson's For Cause and Comrades, which I recommend and will cite several times in this brief video. The question of whether Southern men fought for slavery is surprisingly layered, and ignoring the nuance of it in pursuit of a yes or no answer leads to a very simplistic understanding. For example, many arguments have been made based on letters from Confederate soldiers in which they defend slavery as an institution. There are two big points that we have to take into account here. Case in point, McPherson cites, "This country without slave labor would be completely worthless," wrote a lieutenant in the 28th Mississippi in 1863. "We can only live and exist by that species of labor, and hence I am willing to fight to the last." That seems pretty airtight, Confederates explicitly fighting for slavery. But we could make a completely different argument by selectively citing letters like that of a lieutenant in the 3rd Missouri who said that he was fighting gloriously for the undying principles of constitutional liberty and self-government. Or, moving away from officers to the more working-class enlisted perspective, a corporal in the 9th Alabama said, "I am engaged in the glorious cause of liberty and justice, fighting for all that we of the South hold dear." But you can find evidence to support either a fighting for slavery or a fighting for liberty argument. But if you really want to understand the history of it on its own terms, you have to take all of it and embrace the contradictions. Additionally, we have to consider that for every letter or diary entry making grand political or philosophical statements, there are hundreds like this from Private Daniel Abernathy of the 16th North Carolina. "Dear wife, I again take the opportunity of writing you a few lines to let you know that I am well at this time, truly hoping these few lines may come safe to you and find you well. I have no news of much importance to write at the time, only war news. Time is hard here. I am in hopes I will get a furlough sometime this spring." Point being that the vast bulk of what Confederate soldiers were writing about is the same things that soldiers are usually writing about. Missing home, complaining about bad footwear and food, things of that sort. According to McPherson, only about 20% of Confederates expressed any pro-slavery opinion at all in these writings based on a sample of surviving letters and diaries from several hundred soldiers. Slavery just was. It was part of their background. The often cited slavery-boosting letters need to be taken in that context. The majority of the Confederate soldiers were not expressing a sense of being part of a grand crusade to preserve it, at least not the thing in and of itself. With that in mind, let's look at those pro-slavery statements. Here's where people either dismiss it as semantics or see the subtle but important distinction that reveals the motivations at work. "We can only live and exist by that species of labor," quoted earlier, is primarily an economic argument. "We would be slaves to the Yanks, and our children would have a yoke of bondage thrown around their neck," writes a private from Mississippi, of the future he fears. "The institutions of the whole South" is a recurring phrase that encompasses not only slavery, but the entire social and economic structure built on it. And of course, the racial argument among lower-class whites. "I never want to see the day when a Negro is put on equality with a white person." Others talked about servile insurrections of freed slaves plundering the countryside in roving bands or of Yankee-enforced miscegenation. Usually when someone is going on about white supremacy today, they're being a tad ridiculous. But in the Confederacy, it was a central pillar of the social order. But what is easily overlooked here is that all of these are focused not on slavery per se, but on the feared consequences of abolishing slavery. If you approach the Confederacy as just a bunch of racist bullies, then you can't understand how it was the endgame of a distinct Southern culture and socioeconomic system that had evolved over the course of hundreds of years. That's not a defense. I always side against slavers on general principle. It's to illustrate that history is usually a lot more complex and nuanced than the popular narrative makes it out. Civil wars doubly so, and oversimplified answers are sometimes worse than no answer at all. The simplest we can make it is that slavery was the underlying cause of the war, but slavery itself was rarely why the men were fighting. At least, not strictly on its own inherent merits. With that in mind, let's look at those pro-slavery statements. That's going to be misquoted.